All right, welcome everyone. We've talked about hydration and aerobic performance. Now we're going to switch to more higher intensity anaerobic performance. So, what are the impacts of dehydration on performance? Well, if you look at 3 to 4% dehydration, you have -2 and 3% declines in maximal strength and maximal power, respectively. However, strength endurance, like a set of 12 reps, for example, on squats, which is around 30 to 120 seconds of all-out work, you get -10%. So the more it becomes more like endurance, the greater decrements that you'll get. One of the things I want to point out is that the decrements that you get from 3 to 4% dehydration are greater for muscular endurance than muscular strength. We can see that here. You get anywhere from like 20 to 40% or 20 to 30% declines in muscular endurance with 3 to 4% dehydration, but the highest responders like 10% in this study, whereas most of them are 5% and under. So a lot of people go, who cares about dehydration in anaerobic sports? That's not the case. Because if you look at sport, it's the second, the millisecond, the inch that makes one person finish first and one person last. In fact, if you look at the last 3 Olympic Games, those games indicate the gold medalist in the 100-meter dash defeated the 8th place finisher by an average of only 3%. So if you have that 3% decline in performance, that could be the difference between you being first and last. So again, if you look at the threshold for aerobic versus anaerobic, declines in performance for aerobic is about 2%. But for anaerobic, you do see declines at 3%. However, those declines are a lot more at 4%. So the threshold for that drastic drop-off in performance maybe as little as 2% for aerobic and as great as 3 to 4% for anaerobic. So to notice those differences, you have to be a little bit more dehydrated. Now, why is this the case? Well, one mechanism is a decrease in central drive. So you look at central drive, and this graph is basically 100 times maximal voluntary torque divided by maximal voluntary torque plus electrically evoked torque. Just recall that if you're centrally fatigued, you're not going to be able to activate as much muscle tissue. And we can see the difference between what you can voluntarily activate and what you actually can activate when you add electrically evoked torque. Okay, because you're able to stimulate all the muscle fibers. We can see that percent force or percent central drive is greatest in euhydrated, lowers in 2.5% dehydrated, or minus 2.5% hydrated, and lowers even more with minus 5% hydration. One thing we also see is a decrease in training volume. And again, this is strength endurance. So they did bench, lat pull downs, military press, curls, triceps, and leg extensions. And they did 3 sets of basically their 12 RM load. So how much they could lift for 12 reps. You see the hydrated here is the stripes, and the dehydrated is the black. Notice that total volume is lower on all the exercises. In fact, you see a 15% decline in total training volume. So if you're a bodybuilder and you're training in that 8 to 12 repetition range, that could be a problem. Despite the fact that your volume's lower, if you look at the black group compared to the stripe group, RPE, or rate of perceived exertion, is actually higher in the dehydrated versus the hydrated. So your total work's down, but you actually perceive the work as being harder. Same thing with heart rate. the black is dehydrated, the striped is hydrated. Heart rate is higher at every time point. One thing I do want to point out is that velocity of contraction does make an impact on the outcome. So very high velocity contractions are not as affected as low velocity contractions. That's important. Let me say that again. Very high velocity contractions are not as affected as low velocity contractions. Hayes actually found that slow velocity and isometric contractions were impaired past 2.6% dehydration, while high velocity isolated contractions were not affected even at levels of 4% dehydration. So what this tells us is what? Why is this important? Well, if you look at bodybuilders, they typically use slower cadences and controlled contractions. They also focus on the isometric squeeze at the top of the lip, and they train with higher volumes. So they're interested in strength endurance and focus contractions, both of which are impacted by hydration status. But it's not just that can impair performance in trying to gain mass. There's another theory we'll talk about in our advanced training variable class called the cell swelling theory. Basically, the cell swelling theory suggests that as you increase the swelling of the cell, that you actually activate growth factors. So this is one method that we've used in our lab to increase cell swelling. That's me. What you notice I'm doing is I'm restricting blood flow. And as I restrict blood flow, you can see that the muscles swell. This is a picture on our ultrasound. You see the thickness here of the muscle is 4.42. And then after this training model, it goes from 4.42 to 5.16. A clear increase in the swelling response. So if we look at this, basically you have numerous studies that have shown that hydration-mediated cell swelling results in increased protein synthesis and a decrease in protein breakdown in virtually all cell types, including muscle fibers. This is sort of the working model that we have. If you have an increase in cell swelling, that's sensed by possibly a volume sensor, which increases protein synthesis and upregulates gene expression related to growth. But one of the things I want to point out is that dehydration can cause the opposite of cell swelling. Okay, so if you look at what happens, if you become dehydrated, extracellular fluid lowers. The concentration of solute increases in the blood. That is known as a hypertonic state. If you look at the picture to the right, the hypertonic state, in a hypertonic state, when the concentration of solute increases the blood, you're going to have a normalization of the osmolarity, intracellular and extracellular. That's going to cause the cells to crenate or shrink. That's the opposite of what you want. Okay, so if you look at serum osmolarity, there's a concentration of solute. If you train and you have no fluid, it increases to a much greater extent than when you actually have a large amount of fluid. So osmolarity is greater. If we look at intracellular fluid and plasma osmolarity, as plasma osmolarity goes up, intracellular fluid goes down. Again, look at this graph. As plasma osmolarity goes up, which occurs when you're in a dehydrated state, intracellular fluid goes down. In this study, what they looked at is type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers, their cross-sectional area. You have a hypohydrated state. You have, a hypo-osmo state. So in other words, the osmolarity is lower than normal. Then you have a control group. Then you have a hyperosmotic state, and that's the black. So the hypo is the white, the control is the striped, the black is the hyper. Notice that the cell size shrinks with increasing osmolarity. Again, the cell size shrinks with increasing osmolarity. This is the opposite of what you want when you're trying to grow. One thing here is that these graphs show you is that if you look when total body water goes down and intracellular water goes down, which are the two upper parts of this figure, you look at the lower right, total body protein goes down. So basically, if you have a increase in osmolarity, a decrease in cell hydration, you have a loss of muscle proteins. And again, this is a graph just showing the relationship between increases in osmolarity on the top horizontal axis and decreases in intracellular fluid. So as plasma osmolarity goes up, intracellular fluid goes down, just in the hypertonic state that we see in that figure to the right. This is a picture of the mechanism how, again, we see the EDL muscle in the soleus in a hypo-control and hyperosmotic state. What you notice here is that basically if you have high osmolarity, H2O is going to leave and go into the blood, causing the cell to shrink. Other thing to worry about is that insulin resistance increases when you have a decrease in cell volume. So the cell doesn't respond as well to insulin. In fact, if you look at fasting levels of insulin, and then you look at here, the top level is when you are only hydrated by when you're dehydrated the most, and then the bottom is when you're euhydrated. Notice insulin levels are much higher in the hypohydrated state, and also glucose levels as well are greater. So it's indicating you have a higher level of glucose and a higher level of insulin, and that you are insulin resistant. Okay, so if you're talking about recovering from training and replenishing glycogen stores and partitioning carbohydrates toward muscle and away from fat, this is not the way to do it. Also, what you see here is that if you look at the euhydrated testosterone response to training, it's greater than the dehydrated state. So actually, dehydration blunts the anabolic response to training. And yet, if we look at cortisol levels, we see that essentially cortisol levels are much greater when you're dehydrated the most compared to when you're euhydrated. So dehydration increases the catabolic response to training. So in summary, dehydration of greater than 3% slightly decreases maximal strength and power, however has a greater effect on repeated high-intensity bouts, such as repeated sprints, such as in hockey or bodybuilding, when you need high volume. Because it does this, hypertrophy training is impaired, particularly when contractions are slow and controlled. Along with impaired volume, there's a decreased swelling response to training, and there's also a decline in the anabolic hormone response and increase in the catabolic hormone response. That's the end of the lecture. Thank you.